Hello, my name is Mary Frances Froehlich. In this presentation, we'll be taking an investigative look at Santiago Calatrava as an architect, artist, and engineer. Through this presentation, I'll be uncovering his understanding, his architectural lineage, as well as his process for creating and executing his forms in order to make them come alive. Who is Santiago Calatrava? Santiago Calatrava is a Spanish-born artist, engineer, and architect whose work has been central to architecture and engineering from the 1980s through the present day. Calatrava is known for creating elaborate projects using unique forms and processes for his creation. He establishes many of his forms by drawing, painting, and sculpting, a practice which he has been performing since childhood. Despite his art and architecture studies, it was not until he finished architecture school that he began studying engineering in order to gain a deeper understanding of how to create the elaborate forms which filled his sketchbook and to push the boundaries of architectural possibilities, a practice for which he is now famous. Throughout this presentation, we'll be taking a close look into Calatrava's history, education, and influence in order to uncover his process, intention, and to discover how he thinks about architecture. The name Santiago Calatrava isn't left without some sort of reaction in the architecture world. Despite his overwhelming success in many projects, Calatrava's sometimes over-the-top forms create controversy due to their exorbitant expense and due to the structural integrity not always holding over time. Nevertheless, Calatrava possesses an extensive understanding of art, engineering, and architecture and pushes the boundaries and creates forms in the built environment that seem next to impossible. Due to this fact, Calatrava is known to have an extravagant style of architecture. Not only do many of his projects contain elements from biology, anatomy, and human form as influences, several of his projects include movement as they are able to expand and contract, a next to impossible feat. You can see here many of his notable projects, which were often described as neo-futuristic, based solely on his ultra-modern design. Calatrava's work is informed by various sources which we will discuss at length throughout this presentation. However, it is worth noting projects that Calatrava finds inspirational and projects which he holds in the back of his mind while creating his own projects. This will give us a deeper look into the mind of Santiago Calatrava. In a recent study with Teen New York Times Magazine, Calatrava listed several of his most influential structures, including, quote, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, the Hagia Sophia, the Alhambra in his native Spain, as well as the American landmarks like the Golden Gate Bridge and the Grand Central Terminal, end quote. In order to understand how Calatrava arrived at some of his most extravagant forms and buildings, which we viewed a moment ago, we have to understand where he's been, what speaks to him, and to gain a bit of insight on the architects who paved the way for him. Calatrava drew influence from many artists, engineers, and architects while establishing his style and studying his craft. Calatrava was also fascinated by the work of Louis Kahn, Marc Rothko, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, just to name a few. Calatrava is known to be enormously enamored with the Kimball Art Museum as well as the Salk Institute. Additionally, a young Calatrava was fascinated by the work of Corbusier at the Ronchamps Chapel, as well as the Unité de Habitation stairs, which appear to move in a propeller-like motion. He called this an amazing configuration of uncanny shapes. As we move through the presentation, you will see the influence of these architects' works and Calatrava's work, particularly as it pertains to his projects with concrete and unique forms. Before taking a look at Calatrava's architecture, it's imperative that we understand that he is heavily influenced by art, painting, and sculpting, and that he is considered a master of these subjects as well. As a child and throughout his life, Calatrava studied the work of Michelangelo, Edgar Degas, Diego Velázquez, to name a few. He was intent on studying and perfecting and accurately depicting the human form, both on paper and in clay. All of these influences are very important so that we might understand how Calatrava arrives at almost all of his work. After understanding Calatrava's innate ability to create form with art, we can begin to see how his sketching directly relates to some of his built work. Calatrava has said when he begins a project, he will begin sketching, painting, and sculpting. Then he will refine these works into construction documents in order to build the project. He has stated in the Complete Works of Santiago Calatrava book that he likened his process to that of Michelangelo, saying, quote, Michelangelo tackled the design of architectural work very much like he would have done a preparatory drawing, with a sense of freedom and obstruction. Both qualities I admire. I have tried to emulate his attitude by using sketches of bodily gesture as preliminary studies for my architecture. A perfect example of this is in New York City at the New York City Transportation Hub. We can see that he begins with a watercolor of a bird, which was refined into an X formation, and that formation became the support columns and overall form of the New York City Transportation Hub. As stated before, Calatrava begins all new projects with the method of sketching, painting, and sculpting. He believes that these methods are essential to creation and form. The sketches of what would become the Lyon Airport Station show how Calatrava begins his process with the form he will lead into with his projects. He begins with a simplistic watercolor form, which he turned into a sketch of a bird-like sculpture. He then creates a sculpture from the drawing, which then becomes a guidepost for the project. Here we can see how Calatrava used his method of form creation in the lay hemispheric. He starts with a sketch and study of the human eye to create a basic form which he then expounds upon. In this building, you can see how he used the same eye form in both the plan and the section. In plan, the iris of the eye is in the center of the building where the building's auditorium is located. In section, you can see the auditorium is a dome-like structure consistent with the overall initial form of the eye. In the project of the turning torso, one of Calatrava's most famous projects, there is obviously a direct connection between his human form sketches and the twisting sculpture, which led to the form of the building. He states that he, quote, like Rodin, feels compelled to portray the human body in motion. I draw the body to understand its movements. His theory of portraying the body in motion used the idea in the turning torso. Each of the 9 levels of the popular apartment complex twist at a 10-degree angle, totaling a 90-degree twist between all the floors. This design is to mimic the twisting of a human body. In this project, the Museum of Tomorrow, you can see another example of Calatrava's process. Like all of his projects, he begins with sketching of the form and the movement. Here you can see the transition from the sketch, but instead of using the human form here as inspiration, he's using the overall movement of the 3 bodies in motion. Before Calatrava became the architect we know today, he was working through extensive research and analysis in engineering while seeking his PhD. He was focused on his doctoral thesis on the foldability of space frames. He was particularly interested in the moving and collapsing capabilities of various properties of material. As stated in the book, The Complete Works of Calatrava, quote, the goal of the dissertation, the study of the frame structures that could move, implied the study of constraints that permit these frames to open, stretch flat, and form an umbrella-like dome, collapse, and close to string into a compact rod. These studies were a springboard for Calatrava as he would go on to create buildings which seemingly defy gravity by their ability to move and change. Obvious through his sketches, which directly relate to his built environment, that Calatrava is inspired by the human form in biology. Because of this, and due to the fact that many of Calatrava's works have moving capabilities, as though they are a biological function, they have been coined with the term biomimicry. Calatrava studied the work of expert engineers as an engineering student and later became the mentee of engineer Felix Candela. The two worked closely together, and Calatrava grew in experience and expounded on the work of Candela. You can see Felix Candela's manipulation of concrete in his columns, which would later influence Calatrava's projects. You can see the greater influence of engineer Robert Millert, as he was one of the first engineers to create an arch structure using reinforced concrete. Calatrava would take this influence and run with it over the course of his career. Using the knowledge he gained while working for Candela, Calatrava expounded on Candela's and Millert's work and began to manipulate and utilize reinforced concrete, which is present in almost all of his architecture today. Calatrava was also heavily inspired by Mitchell and Ritchie architects. The pair designed a retractable roof structure over a civic auditorium in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1961. The image on the top right shows the civic auditorium with retractable roof compared to Calatrava's Polytechnical University in Florida. In addition, this slide highlights one of Calatrava's most famous works, the Milwaukee Art Museum, which also has a moving component designed after a bird taking flight. To the Civic Auditorium, Calatrava was walking on the stepping stones of world-renowned engineer Buckminster Fuller's work in geometrical design. These influences are heavily present as Calatrava continues to push structural boundaries, all while remaining consistent in his creation of form. In addition to Calatrava's many engineering feats with architecture, his expertise in engineering is obvious in his bridge design. The bridges themselves are examples of what marrying architecture and engineering can do, which is Calatrava's forte. The bridges do not give up artistic or architectural integrity as they're designed using Calatrava's standard method of form creation, which he employs in order to create beautiful structures. Not only is the form based on a biological study of a bird in flight, the Alamillo Bridge, according to the Journal of Engineering, is based on a balance of forces. Cable forces were to balance out pylon weights, resolving in a purely axial force in the pylon, and the resultant pylon axial force was to balance out the deck axial force to create a purely vertical reaction at the support. This allowed for the bridge to maintain its light and ethereal quality. The Samuel Beckett Bridge on the top is designed in a similar way, which allows the rotating structure of the cable-stayed bridge to move with the appearance of effortlessness, while the complex engineering system Calatrava designed works in the background to keep the bridge standing in elegance. To conclude, Santiago Calatrava is an expert in his craft. Although he faces immense criticism over a few of his projects, it does not lessen the fact that he's a brilliant architect, engineer, and artist. He has pushed boundaries in architecture and engineering and made a way for many architects to follow his work. By understanding his knowledge and expertise, we're able to further understand Calatrava and how he creates his work with such intentionality.